We're continuing our study in Paul's letter to the church at Corinth. We've worked our way up to chapter 7. And up to this point, Paul has been addressing the attitudes of the Corinthian church. Paul pointed out earlier in the letter that the Corinthian church, that the members there had incorrect attitudes. They were thinking about things in the wrong way. And so from chapters 1 through chapter 6 in Paul's letter, he addresses these various attitude issues. And now, coming to chapter 7, Paul starts chapter 7, verse 1, "Now, concerning thereof the things you wrote unto me." So this is a shift. This is a different section of the book. And now Paul is preparing to answer questions that apparently the Corinthian church had sent him a letter asking him these questions. Things they didn't know about, things they were confused about. And at the top of the list of things that the Corinthian church was confused about was the topic of marriage, was the topic of how husband and wife should relate to each other. You see, the Corinthian church lived in a very loose culture, very permissive, sexually very permissive culture, not unlike the culture we live in today. And there was a lot of confusion around marriage. There was a lot of confusion around sex, sexual expression, sexual identity, and all these issues that are swirling around today. And so Paul addresses these, starting here. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. So what he says here, it's okay to be single. It is okay not to marry. Singleness is sometimes people who are single are thought of as second-class citizens. They're thought of as being less than fulfilled. But the truth is, Paul says that being single is good. It is a good thing for a man not to be married. That's what, not to touch a woman. This is the idea of sexually being involved, connected with a woman. So Paul is saying it is good to be single. We shouldn't think of single as second-class citizens. Nevertheless, so he doesn't stop there. He continues in verse 2, "Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband." And so we see that singleness is good, and marriage is also good. But marriage is defined as one man and one woman. And this was set down to avoid fornication, to avoid sexual sin. Fornication gives the idea of sexual sin. To keep us out of sexual sin, God instituted marriage between one man and one woman. And there are a lot of ideas about sex floating around. You can get your ideas about sex from the locker room, from the TV, from the movie theater. You can get your idea about sex from magazines, library books, and all kinds of places. But the place to learn about sex is in the Bible. The Bible talks about sex. And Paul here starts a very frank, sober, sensible discussion, very dignified. He doesn't use coarse language. He's not going to make your grandmother blush, talking about sex and how to think about sex. This is what he says. Verse 3. "Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband." But what Paul says here in verse 3 is that husband and wives have a sexual duty to one another. That you are indebted, if you're married, you are indebted to your marriage partner to be willing to have sex. That is a duty. It is a debt that we have to one another. That's what Paul says here. Render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise the wife unto the husband. So this is something that is natural, and it's a injunction of Scripture. Paul continues here in verse 4. The wife has not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. So when it comes to the marriage bed, the idea here is think about your partner first. What Paul is saying is put your partner first, satisfy your partner first, put their needs ahead of your needs and your needs second. And this is a boundary that's on the marriage bed to prevent abuse, to prevent perversion. There's lots of perversions of sex. But to put a check on those things, Paul says here that the wife doesn't have power of her own body, but the husband has that power. And the husband doesn't have power of his own body, but the wife has that power. So the idea is we don't own our bodies. Somebody else owns our bodies. And so we don't make demands in the marriage bed that are unnatural. It is wrong to withhold sex, and it's also wrong to demand sex. So we can't demand it from our partner, and we can't withhold it from our partner. And you can't use it as a bargaining chip with your partner. So this is an honest look at the sexual relationship. And Paul strengthens that in verse 5, defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. Defraud ye not. That means don't withhold what is due. Your partner is due sex. They're owed that. Don't withhold that from your partner. That's what he's saying. You can't defraud one another that way. You can't defraud one another that way because it opens the door for Satan. When you withhold sex from your lawful partner, it opens the door to temptation. It opens the door to all kinds of evils. But Paul says, don't do that. Except, and he gives an exception here, that you agree for a time, that you consent with one another for the purpose of fasting and prayer. So if fasting is one of your habits, fasting and prayer, then agree to not have sex, that you can devote yourself to fasting and prayer. There would also be things like for an illness, for example. We're talking about normal circumstances, not exceptions such as a time of illness. There may be times in a relationship when you cannot enjoy your partner. But he's talking about the normal times. Defraud not one another. Now, starting in verse 6, Paul switches to a different topic. He says, but I speak this by permission, talking about what he's going to say in verse 7. But I speak this by permission and not of commandment. So here, Paul says, okay, I'm going to give you guys some advice. And this is the advice I'm giving you. Verse 7, for I would that all men were even as myself, but every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. So Paul, that's my advice to you. That if you can stay single, that's what he says, that's what it means right here, this first sentence. For I would that all men were even as myself. So Paul says, my advice is that I wish everybody would be single like me. Now, Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, and one of the requirements to be a member of the Sanhedrin was to be married. So we can conclude that Paul was married at some point, but history is silent as to what became of Paul's wife. We don't know. But at this point in his ministry, he is single, and he's wishing. He says, "This is not a commandment, but I wish. I think it's better if you were like me, if you were single." Now, if you look in 1 Timothy, chapter 4, Paul is writing in a different place, a different context, a different time. I can flip there. He talks again about marriage. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1 through 3. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seditious spirits, doctrines of devils, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, and look, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats which God has created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. So that's why Paul doesn't command anybody to get married. Paul says, because in latter days, people are going to command people not to marry. They're going to forbid them from marriage. So Paul doesn't do that here. He doesn't give a commandment that you should not marry. Because in the latter days, there's going to be commandments forbidding marriage. And those things are of the devil. And that there's going to be the idea of people forbidding you from eating certain foods. Think vegans. Forbidding the eating of certain foods that God has commanded. These things are, Paul writes there, come from the devil. They're lies of the devil. So Paul here is just offering his opinion when he says, I speak this by permission and not as commandment. He continues here in verse 7, but every man hath his proper gift, one after this manner and another after that. So Paul doesn't give commandments when it comes to whether you're married or not. Paul doesn't give commandments when it comes to your spiritual gift. Paul doesn't give commandments around these things, these gifts of God, and how God has called you. I say therefore to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. So he repeats. He's a repeat of what he said in the verse above. It is good to remain single. If that's what God has called you to. That's an important qualifier. It's good to remain single if that's what God called you to. And if you're called to singleness, don't fret. Don't sweat. Don't worry about what other people think. That's what God called you to. Then he gives it out, verse 9. But if they cannot contain themselves, let them marry. Because it's better to marry than to burn. The idea is burning with passion, inflamed passion. It's better to marry than to let these unbridled passions run wild in your life. Because that is a door for the devil. The devil can jimmy and sneak through a door like that. So, marry. Verse 10. And unto the married, now he's going to give a commandment. I command, notice he says, yet not I, but the Lord commanded, let not the wife depart from her husband. So now we do have command. This is not advice. It's a commandment of God that the wife should not depart from her husband. And he's going to get to the husband in a minute. But these things are commands. Matthew 19. But if she depart, notice the but. So there's a commandment, and then there's this clause right away acknowledging that that this is a fallen world. And now he's going to talk about the exception of what happens if you if you break this commandment. This is how to react. But if you break the commandment, and if she departs, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. That's your two choices. If the wife leaves, you can either stay unmarried or be reconciled. That's the choices. And now, Paul turns to the husband with the same advice. Let not the husband put away the wife. So the same thing applies in both directions. It applies to husband and wife. This is a commandment for husband and wife, that the wife is not to leave the husband and the husband is not to put away the wife. But to the rest I speak. Now there's Paul talking to married again. But to the rest I speak I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. So here Paul is addressing a situation in which two people were married before they became Christians. And now the husband has become a Christian. So now he's wondering, what should I do? Should I divorce my wife? We don't have the same values anymore. This is kind of an awkward situation. And this is what Paul's advice is. If she's pleased to live with you, keep the marriage intact. Don't divorce her. Don't divorce that woman just because you became a Christian and she didn't. And verse 13 is the opposite. And the woman which has a husband that believe not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. God is not in the business of breaking up marriages. God wants to keep those marriages together. He acknowledges that we are sinful, and he understands that. But it's God's desire to keep those marriages together. And he talks about the reason why that's the case. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. So by being married to a Christian, the idea is that the household is under the protection of God. It's just one believing partner, and the kids are under the protection of God. That's what sanctified means. They've been set apart, made holy. So that believer, that's this believing spouse, brings a blessing into the home. In another place, Peter talks about being an example to your unbelieving spouse. Living with your unbelieving spouse, that they may see your example and turn to the Lord. That they may become a Christian. And now Paul acknowledges the reality of life. But if the unbelieving depart, let them depart. It's okay. If they feel like they don't want to live in a Christian household, if that unbelieving partner wants to leave, Paul says, let them leave. They can leave. And he says a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Not under bondage means they can get married again. If this unbeliever leaves the marriage of their own free will, then the believing partner is not under any obligation. It's not under any bondage. They can marry again as they see fit. And Paul gives the explanation for this because God has called us to peace. God didn't call us to war with our partner. God doesn't want us fighting in the house. He doesn't want to make a war. Peace. God has called us to peace. Be at peace in your house and with your neighbor. And then Paul expresses this idea again. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? That the unbelieving partner would see the example of the Christian and become a Christian. The whole house would be saved. How glorious. How wonderful. And now Paul starts a new section here in verse 17. But as God has distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk, and so I ordain in all the churches. Now Paul is taking up the topic of people who become Christians but are somehow dissatisfied with their situation. Or they hear the call of God in their life, but they say, I don't want to become a Christian yet. I want to get my life cleaned up first. Paul says, don't do that. When you hear the call of God in your life, don't say to yourself, I'm not good enough to be a Christian. I want to wait. I want to start going to church. I want to start doing this. I want to start doing this. And then I'll become a Christian. And the idea is no. When you hear the call of God in your life, answer the call. Answer. Take God at his word and answer him as Lord. So here Paul goes into some examples. So two examples. He's going to give the idea of circumcision and the idea of servants. So if you are called, so one is something that you have control over, the other is something you don't have control over in your life. So first, verse 18. Let me start a third time. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in circumcision? Let him not be circumcised. This is the calling of God in your life. When you hear the call of God in your life, you say to yourself, I'm circumcised and I shouldn't be, or I'm uncircumcised and I ought to be. Paul says, circumcision is nothing, in verse 19, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandment of God. That's what he says. So don't worry about these incidentals in your life. So the idea of circumcision, it's important to remember that the Greeks exercised in the nude. They had their athletic events, the Olympics. These things were conducted in the nude. And so the uncircumcised person was easy to spot. And this would cause perhaps some, if the person was circumcised, they may feel some social pressure that they were circumcised. And the circumcision was viewed as a mutilation in Greek and Roman culture. And so they would have a minor surgical procedure to make it look like they were uncircumcised. They would do this surgery. They could do this surgery back 2,000 years ago to make it appear as if you were uncircumcised. So you've been circumcised as a baby. Now you have this surgery procedure. This is a plastic surgery in effect. Now nobody can tell. So and we have this in our culture today. You have this today. People have this body piercings, this tattoos and things. This is something that people want to fit in. They want to do this to be a part. They have this idea. So you want to change your body. So the idea is that you want to make some change before you become a Christian. If you're circumcised, you want to become uncircumcised. If you're circumcised is the other way, not circumcised, you want to become circumcised. Paul says, don't worry about these things. Don't worry about these minor things. Heed the call of God in your life. That's the point of the thing. Now he repeats here, verse 20, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. So he had said that earlier, now he repeats that, and now he gives a different example, verse 21. This is an example of something that you cannot control. So circumcision you can control. Your station in life as a slave, you don't have any control over that. So Paul is going to talk about that. Art thou called? Did you hear the call of God in your life when you were a slave? This is what Paul says. Care not for that. But if thou mayest be free, use it rather. So if you were a slave, and God calls you to be a Christian, don't think that you can't be a Christian because you're a slave. Not true. God recognizes your station in life. God recognizes that you are a slave. And accept the call of God. Accept God where you are. Even in your slavery, you can accept God. But if you have the chance to be free, take advantage of the freedom. Don't ignore the freedom if you have the chance to be free. But don't think that you have to not become a Christian because you're a slave. For verse 22, for he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. But when God calls you, as you are a slave, the idea of being God's freeman means that God is your protector. God is your provider. God sustains you. God is your patron, as it were. God's watching out for you. That's what he's saying. You're a slave. God watches out for you. God understands your station in life, your situation in life. Likewise, now he talks to the other hand. Likewise also, he that is called being free is Christ's servant. So if it's a slave master, if it's the master who hears the call of God, he has slaves, accept the call of God. Recognizing that your master, as a master, you are God's servant. You're not free to do all that you want to do, anything you want to follow your passions, but only as they are constrained by God. You're God's servant now. Listen to the voice of God. If you're a master, you listen to the voice of God and you act and you do as God says. You're Christ's servants. So slave or master can both hear and respond to the call of God in their life. Paul reminds us, ye are bought with a price, be ye not servants of men. Recognize that Christ has purchased us. Christ has a claim on our life, and the claim of Christ is higher than the claim of the masters and the men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. Listen, be happy where you are. Be satisfied. Satisfied with your station in life. Satisfied with God. Hallelujah.